Hello, everybody. My name's Nate Van Kampen, and for this audio recording slash pseudo podcast episode, I'm going to be talking about two different theorists who have influenced the way we understand language development and language acquisition. And they have differing theories, and I'm going to just walk through the two theorists and kind of compare and contrast, as well as outline some of the different implications for the way we put these theories into practice in our ESL classroom. The first theorist is Noam Chomsky. I always get his first name mixed up, but Noam Chomsky, and he is a linguist from MIT, pretty well known. He is well known for his political viewpoints and his activism in that regard, as he is for his groundbreaking linguistics theory, which is called the theory of universal grammar, or just the UG theory, which we'll be calling it from kind of here on in. And the UG theory is kind of based on the idea that language is innate, it's hardwired into us, and so we are born with this kind of universal ability to learn and acquire language. It's a response to theories that came before him, and we'll get into that in a little bit, that kind of viewed humans as blank slates, only enacted upon by their environment. He would take what's called a nativism or a nativist approach, where saying there's actually things he would postulate that are hardwired into our brain, that's universal, that act as constraints about how we develop our first language. He would kind of cite that babies go through the same stages of development no matter what language they are learning. And infants learn faster than they should if they're just blank slate. Something must be hardwired in. He points to babbling, and I say he, there's many other researchers who have built on his work and his theories as well, as babbling, if you look across various languages, the types of consonants and the types of vowels used in babies babbling are very similar. And not only that, babies learn vocabulary in their native language or their first language kind of at the same rate. So this tells us that there's something fundamental, that our brains are configured for language, even though they're not configured for a specific language. They are configured to learn a language. And so while the specifics of sentence structures, kind of where the subject, verb, and objects fit into a sentence, and the order they go in changes from language to language, the outline, or kind of this box of grammatical structures, is hardwired in according to this theory. So for example, the meaning of these things can be understood even if the sentence is jumbled. However, a sentence can have correct grammatical order but still be nonsense because the words do not work together to create a meaning that connects to a lived experience. So one example that I came across here is Robert Book reads the. Now we can understand the meaning of that sentence even though the sentence structure is incorrect. However, colorless green ideas sleep. This mental grammar is not necessarily the same for all languages, but according to Chomsky and theorists, the process by which, if any given language, certain sentences are perceived as correct while others are not is universal and independent of meaning. So this kind of theory that Chomsky created and people have researched was created in kind of response to years and years of kind of behavioralist theories, which would advocate that we are a blank slate and only enacted upon by an environment. One of the major proponents of this is the renowned psychologist B.F. Skinner. So he's like the second theorist that we're going to look at. And we're going to contrast their views in just a second, and we will get to connecting them to how they apply to developing not just your first language, but for our context, how someone can acquire a second language. So Skinner says, just to introduce him, he says, I don't deny the importance of genetics. However, the fact that I might be altruistic isn't because I have a gene for altruism. The fact that I do something for my children at some cost to myself comes from a history that has operated on me. So Skinner developed this theory called operant behavior, when he basically says that behaviors uh, are shaped by our environment. And when he set out to study psychology, he really took an empiricist view of saying that anything that we can study has to be observable and measurable. While he doesn't deny the existence of the mind, he did not think it was a field worth studying in a scientific manner, because the mind itself, its intentions, what goes inside, cannot be observed or measured. Only our behaviors can, hence behavioralism. Skinner's research really focused on how behaviors are shaped. And his research showed that behaviors can be shaped through either positive or negative reinforcement, external conditions. So a reinforcement would increase a behavior, whereas a punishment would decrease a behavior. And when you apply this to language learning, it really takes the view that when you try to learn a new language, it's a blank slate. The meaning or nothing, there's nothing really hardwired in. It takes a teacher directly either reinforcing positive outcomes and then punishing, and that doesn't have to sound as like terrible as it is, but negative language usage. And so incorrect language needs to be corrected, and good language usage needs to be reinforced. A lot of this is through repetition and immediate reinforcement and punishment. And this has actually really influenced a lot of ESL classrooms, or just classrooms in general, over the years, even though folks like Chomsky and others, other theorists even come after that to look at different ways that we learn in kind of a more subtle and nuanced way, that the way our mind and the way we construct meaning. So constructivist views have also maybe showed us that we learn much more in a much more complicated way than this. Our classrooms still often reflect these types of practices. So the repeat after me, and when they get it right, you give them a smile as a reinforcement, and when they don't get it right, you make them do it again and correct them. These are kind of operant behavioralist ways of teaching. Chomsky does not really talk too much about second language acquisition, actually. And I was doing some different research, and I did find some folks who have tried to take this idea of UG, of universal grammar, and apply it to second language learning. And I'm just going to maybe walk through some of the things that I found and discovered in some of the research, and I'll have a list of all my resources on the slideshow that kind of goes with this audio recording. So here's a few things that I've learned about universal grammar when it comes to second language acquisition, which may start leading us into whether or not there's anything that can be applied to actual classroom techniques. So I came across a book by Catherine Doty and Michael Long. It's a 889-page document that is called the Handbook to Second Language Acquisition, and it does gather a bunch of different theorists and kind of place them in a logical way on how they interact with each other. The researcher they cited and used information from about universal grammar is a woman from McGill named Lydia White, Dr. White, and she focuses her work on the role, if any, that UG plays in acquiring a second language. She talks about how Chomsky never uh, maybe alluded to it some of his work, but never really spent a lot of time talking about second language acquisition with universal grammar. And through some of the kind of the meta-analysis of the research on second language and universal grammar, she concludes that although universal grammar provides constraints on possible grammars in the course of acquisition, it is not of itself a theory of acquisition. So what she is saying in that quote is she distinguishes UG as a developmental theory, not a representational theory. This means that UG as a developmental theory explains like the how and the why, what's going on as we learn grammatical structures, as opposed to a representational theory which explains or just shows what is happening when someone's learning it. And those representational theories really are much more connected to learning theories, the very practical, what does it look like to learn a language, what kind of pedagogical and instructive techniques can we use, and then the developmental theory speaks to what internal processes are going on as we're learning. And so I found it challenging based on what I've read to try to come up with really like practical ways to apply universal grammar theory to Monday morning in your ESL classroom. Uh, Much of the research White cites in this chapter suggests that universal grammar acts more of as a constraint on learning new grammatical formations in another language. The research uses methodology that isolates grammatical structures between two languages, um, and then forces somebody to learn a new structure that would not be possible drawing knowledge from their first language, therefore proving that UG is still at work when we're acquiring our second language. And a lot of it is done through kind of language and linguistic and grammatical problem solving. And so there could be something there in how we would have our kind of guide our ESL instruction, um, but it's not as concrete as I think I would like to find it. So a few conclusions about how to though put this in practice. I do have a few thoughts here. So the so what of this all? Well, we know that just knowing perhaps UG exists helps the ESL teacher, and actually if your students were capable of understanding this theory, they could maybe benefit from knowing that this is going on. It gives them confidence that they can problem solve language. It allows the teacher to use direct methods of teaching without feeling the students need to produce immediate results. This would be in contrast to maybe some of the behavioralist stuff where you need to immediately repeat and reinforce, and it feels a bit more pressure that if you don't get it now and we don't reinforce it now, you're not going to acquire this language. You have to memorize these vocabulary words. Here's a list. We're going to put them in context. But just kind of coming back here to this idea of universal grammar and the applications to the classroom, could also maybe look at it as students move into later stages of language development, the constraints that kind of UG gives in terms of we can't learn, we're going to have a certain amount of hardwired ability to learn language, kind of gives us confidence to know that our students will learn the language as a tool for communication, even if they're not fluent or perfect yet. It's a real point of emphasis, actually, I like to make in my class with students to say language is a tool for communication. And so if your meaning is understood and received, you've accomplished your goal. Can we get better at it? Can we be more efficient with it? Can we be more correct with it? Of course. But that will come. And I think this idea that we have this structure from our first language and also still active, that some of the research shows this kind of idea of these parameters that universal grammar gives us in our brain, our ability to kind of make sense of language in the world, allows us to have the patience for a growth mindset about language. And so that would be a really uh, maybe not a practical teaching method, but a practical mindset that we can have as we teach and learn second languages. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time here comparing, contrasting, and actually maybe talking a little bit about convergence about these two theories. I do this bearing in mind, of course, there are probably a lot more comprehensive and effective theories on how we acquire language, theories that kind of revolve around context and meaning that aren't just purely from a UG perspective, and also theories that do involve things like behavioralist concepts of repetition. Um, and so, kind of, I have contrasted this as I've gone along, but I mean, these two theories really are set apart by the fact uh, that Chomsky really reacted against the behavioralist viewpoint in creating his. Um, and so, right off the bat, it was a reaction against. But I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive in the classroom. I think some of the applications about repetition and practice and reinforcement kind of apply to the way we view feedback in a classroom and assessment. And I think that's really important to give good and immediate positive or negative or constructively negative feedback in terms of student learning. So correction. There's plenty of educational research that shows this actually goes a long way in students' learning, and this totally applies to a language classroom. Um, and so we're not going to throw away the behavioralist, but even if the universal grammar is true, I think they actually converge nicely. One place where they may converge is if we look at stages of language development. In that early stage, in that silent stage, perhaps having a student do a few more rote things that has immediate feedback will give them a few of the tools that they can kind of move forward in terms of basic sentence structure, close activities, fill in the blank, word banks, things like that, where they're going to get immediate, this is right, this is wrong, and if you could reward that right away or give immediate feedback, that's going to reinforce the positive outcomes and kind of decrease the mistakes. And I think that works. And as the language develops, like I kind of already mentioned, perhaps as they become into that intermediate stage where they can now start to communicate ideas just not correctly, we can rely on some more problem solving and inquiry based type methods. And now we're going to get into kind of a constructivist view of language learning where we're using language to construct meaning. But we can't do that unless we kind of have that foundational piece below it. And some of that might be applied through some of those more rote activities, which would maybe fall under a more behavioralist style of learning. And then the meaning construction and the problem solving piece can work knowing that we have this framework, these constraints of universal grammar that will kind of keep us going along and kind of give us the confidence to try new things with our language, to try to create meaning. Like one great example that might fit under the constraints of universal grammar, and it's often cited as a really great, we even talked about it in this course, is the idea of like cooperative learning and strategic groups. When you view language as a tool of communication, and you don't always need to get it perfect, but you can kind of problem solve your way into communicating to be understood, something like a literature circle group makes a whole lot of sense to me. And so I don't know if I have any new revelations about new practices that are going to help us based on these theories, but to connect some of the practices we already do to these two different theories, I think help us be strategic about which practices to use, why, and when. So you may want to choose a behavioralist view because you just need to get your students at a certain level where they can start to feel confident with some basic stuff. If they're in my secondary, an ASL AO or BO student, just trying to build up a base knowledge of basic syntax and vocabulary, some close exercises, some repeat after me kind of stuff, while still providing context, I think is a good building block. But as you kind of progress into the intermediate ESL, CO, EO, using something like literature circles where they're now reading, writing, and speaking and listening all in a second language has tremendous power. So long as you understand kind of that growth mindset piece and your students can understand that, to say you don't need to do this perfectly, you need to use this to communicate and problem solve. And then work together as a group, and the teacher will sit there with them to help kind of problem solve some of these either grammatical or vocabulary or miscommunications of meaning, and really work at your first language. And I think, or sorry, really work in your second language to provide meaning. And as you start to distance yourself from relying on kind of that direct translation from your first to your second language, that's where some of the maybe universal grammar pieces of our brain kick in. Now we're actually problem solving in our second language and learning our second language in our second language. I think of the Rosetta Stone software uses similar kind of problem solving techniques as well when you're learning a language. I use that for practicing Mandarin, and it just really comes down to like pictures and logic to try to figure out the vocab and the grammar. And so that would be an example of something else based on this idea of kind of this universal grammar applying to our second language, even though Chomsky never really talked much about it. Okay, so I think that's about where I'm going to leave it in terms of practice. There are a whole bunch of things at our disposal to kind of sum up, and to me, the idea is being able to connect the theory to what we already do to help us to be more strategic in what we do, and depending on the level of your student, the class you're teaching, and the needs of your student.